Hello, welcome to our February webinar from the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition. Today we're talking about trauma-informed care, and our panelist is Father Ragan Shriver. He's a special assistant to the president of Catholic Charities, and he is also working as the director of social work program at the University of Tennessee. So welcome, Dr. Shriver, Father Doctor. It's good to have you with us. And we have 71 people so far joining us. And for those of you who are joining us, if you have any questions or comments, please use your chat feature on the bottom of your screen, or you can also use the Q&A feature to write your comments or questions, and we will respond to them during the course of this webinar.
Great. Thank you, Father George. It's really great to be with you all. I have to say, we were just speaking about just our interests, and so I got my social work career really started in working with in the criminal justice system, and I've just so honored to be able to kind of share some ideas with you all, and just to say that I thank you for the work that you're doing. It's so important in this world, and working with a population that many want to blame and scapegoat and all those things, and you're there to recognize the dignity and worth of every human person. So it's really great. So I just wanted to share with you all, I have a PowerPoint, of course. I feel like we all have to have an obligatory PowerPoint, but I wanted to just share this so that I can help stay focused on what some of my ideas are around the issue of trauma-informed care, or what people sometimes call trauma-responsive care. So there's different terminology around these things, and we could debate what we really should call it, but I just think the idea is that we're trying to look and help and recognize some of the social difficulties and struggles that people have had, and how we could respond to that in an appropriate way that's the most helpful. And then one other thing that, as was said, I'm from Tennessee. I'm from Tennessee, so you may pick up a little bit of an accent, but I feel a little bit unsouthern by how fast I talk. So so hang on, because here we go. I can talk a little bit too fast, but we'll try to make sure that we can catch what we need to say. So here we go. So trauma responsive care with the justice population is kind of what I've titled this. And so I think about the term, like I was saying about terminology. I feel like that trauma informed can be that I have this knowledge in my head, and that I've got a little part of it in my head, and that it's a bit of a filter on how I work with clients or persons that we are engaged with. Trauma responsive can turn it up a notch to where we're looking at it that I really am actively responding to struggles that people have had, and that I'm aware that people have had these struggles, and I'm aware that this is going on. And so this is how the filter that I want to use. So that's kind of what I want to help you all today, is to sort of create a bit of a filter that maybe that you could look through, that you could view the folks that you're working with through this lens. It might be helpful. So let me just give a quick little case study to start off, just as a little framework. So say that there is a young man, say 28, that's been placed in a prison, and is a prisoner there, and then he has a roommate or a cellmate that's put in there as well. And so the 28-year-old gentleman has been there and has had a pretty good time. He's been following all the programs. He's been doing kind of what the rules are. He's been following things. He's goes to his cell when he's supposed to. He gets engaged in the activities outside the cell when he's supposed to. He's just like looking real good, and looking good for maybe an early parole even. So all these things are going on for him. The cellmate then is introduced into the situation, and things begin to change for the 28-year-old gentleman. We'll call him John. And so John begins to avoid his cell, and then is oftentimes like reluctant to go back to the cell, is reluctant to go back there because since this new cellmate has come. He's actually then begun to kind of stop really taking care of himself. He's become distractible. He's become he sits by himself now at lunch. He doesn't interact with other people. There have been a couple of indications where he's gotten in a fight. There have been difficult things going on for him. So a lot of times I'm assured that in a system like this, in a prison system like that, that would just be, well, let's blame this person. He doesn't want to play the role anymore. He wants to, well, we're going to blame him for his difficulty here and now. Well, maybe a role like that prison ministry could play would be able to see that what's changed, what's different. Everything was going pretty well, and now it's real different. Things have become disjointed. He's run off the rail a little bit. Well, what's the one thing that changed? Well, this introduction of this new inmate, the new cellmate. So maybe if you're engaged with the 28-year-old gentleman, John, you could say, well, what's different? What's going on? Whatever. Oh, well, this new cellmate has come. And then turns out he has a tattoo on his arm. And what's that tattoo? Does it remind you of anything? What's going on? What is that? Does that ring a bell in some way? Well, that the tattoo is exactly like someone who had sexually assaulted John as a young person. And it triggered something. That visual input there, that visual sensation triggered something inside of John. And then it led his ability to cope to really just go out the door. And because he was put in this situation where he's locked up and his life is so regulated, he couldn't use his typical methods for dealing or kind of working through the traumatic impact or this trigger. Maybe in his life when he was out in society, maybe he would engage with alcohol, or maybe he would use drugs, or maybe he would even just go out running, or maybe he would do whatever other things that he could do to deal with this difficulty of this response that he was having. So the strange thing here is that because the visual cue of that tattoo on the new cellmate triggered and brought John back into the experience of the trauma as if he was living it as he did when he was a little child. This is the crazy, strange thing about trauma, is that we could have something that happens to us that's horrible and negative, but it's imprinted in our body, in our mind in some way that then oftentimes when that trigger comes up into us, into our life again, that we respond in the exact same way as if we were in it again. So this is what's happening. So a lot of people, especially in the population that you all are working with, may be blamed or maybe scapegoated for some behavior that they're engaged in, but really it might be just a completely natural response to something traumatic that's happened in their life, and there's a traumatic trigger to that. So let's talk a little bit more about that. But before we kind of get into this, that little case study, I kind of use to refer to it to the rest of our time together. But just basically, if you have to hang up the phone right now, that this is what we're kind of looking at. First of all, is we're shifting from what is wrong with you. So, John, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you following the plan? Is it because you're just non-compliant? Because you're viewed as a criminal? Whatever blaming that we want to do. What's wrong with you? We no longer do that in trauma responsive or trauma informed care. We ask the question, what happened to you? Not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. If we're able to use that as our lens to always kind of look at, so how did someone get into this situation? Maybe it's just all that they had to be able to cope with the traumatic experiences that they had had in their life, and has led them to be in prison. So maybe that's what's happened. So it's this, what happened to you? You know, we could think about lots of people that have difficulties in their life, and we can think, well, gee, what happened to you? That's the important question. That's the paradigm shift right there. And then the second paradigm shift is from control as the provider to collaboration. So say maybe I think I'm going to go into the prison and do my ministry, and I'm going to be the one, and I'm going to set the agenda, and I'm going to be the one that's going to kind of save the day here, because it's all up to me. It's up to me to fix or to cure or to straighten out or whatever I do. But that's not it at all, because folks who have been traumatized, people who have been abused, people who have been exploited, people who have had trauma, significant trauma in their lives, have had someone else was in control and they were out of control. Things were done to them. That's not what we want when we're engaging with people in this situation. We want to collaborate with them. And think about it in particular ways with people who are in the justice system. Everything's happening to them. There's no control whatsoever. So imagine if you as a minister were able to go in and engage in a collaborative model. What would you like to talk about today? I don't know, what would you like to engage on? Just as whatever element that you can give of control to the person that you're working with, then that becomes a collaborative model. Really, the idea of ministry is not like I'm providing ministry to you, but like we're going to lock arms, proverbially, and walk through life together. And that's what we really need. And that's what people who can be a healing thing. Trauma, one of the most things that have been traumatized in people's life is relationships. So if you could provide some sort of, in quotes, a corrective relationship for a person by being in a collaborative relationship with them, then you're on the right path. And you're not asking what's wrong with them, it's what happened to them. And then it's not like I'm in control, I'm going to set the agenda, but hey, what do you want to do? How can we work on this together? How can we walk forward in this together? These are the paradigm shifts of trauma-informed care. So if I could ask you just to look real quickly at these three definitions of trauma. These are three definitions. But I'd like to offer a couple of critiques. Trauma is an emotional response. Well, okay, that's true. It is emotional, but it's also spiritual, it's physical, it's neurological, it's social, it's every aspect of the body. So think back to John there. That was a visual cue that triggered a brain neurological response in him. Yeah, it was emotional because of the way that it reacted, but it's all encompassing. It's not just emotional, it's emotions as well as all aspects of the body. Then we look at psychological trauma may set in after a distressing or life-threatening event. Now, okay, that's true, but also I'd like to expand a little further from Psychology Today to say that it's not just life-threatening. It can be all kinds of different experiences. Something may be traumatic to you that wouldn't be to me, but it's different. It's different. It doesn't have to be life-threatening. It could be just a traumatic. It can be experienced as something that's really negative and tough for someone. Okay, and then also, then the last one there for Merriam-Webster, emotional problems usually for a long time. So I'd like to kind of highlight that feels like a sentence, like here, using the lingo here, that's not some kind of prison sentence, that it's a long time, that you're trapped in this forever. There are a lot of predictive factors that if you've experienced this kind of trauma, that there are things that we could predict about how life will unfold for a person, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can be different for every person, and there can be healing and there can be recovery and all kinds of things that can happen. So I would like to kind of give my own definition. So here's my definition, and I don't want to be assumed to be smarter than Merriam-Webster or anything. I'm not, but I'm just kind of maybe providing a different lens here. Think about this. Okay, in Knoxville, Tennessee, we have a great sewer system. We have a great sewer system, and that system works real well. And when it rains normally, all of the water that comes from the rain goes down into the drains and goes out to the Tennessee River. And that's how it just works. It's a good water removal system. The sewer system works real well in our town. That's when it rains normal amounts. They're typical amounts for the area, geographic area that we're in. But occasionally, it'll be a big, huge storm, like some kind of big flood. And there'll be a big, terrible flood, and the water comes down from the mountains, and it floods up. Well, the water removal system, the sewer system, can't handle that big flooding amount. So the water backs up. The water, you can't drive through it. You can't walk through it. It's all filled up. The drain pipes fill up. It's just really tough. The system we have is really adequate for the normal everyday rain. But then when this big old rain thing comes, then it's not sufficient to be able to handle it. So the system gets backed up. Well, that brings some damaging results. And then even though the water does subside after a week or a couple weeks or whatever, there's still some leftover residue. Maybe some of the roadways are buckled up, or maybe a house might be off of its foundation in some way. So there's this long-term impact that's left because of this system being so overwhelmed by all the amounts of water. So then it creates a time for people to work together to try to heal and bring back and repair and all that kind of stuff. There can be a path to recovery after that. So let me compare that little analogy to our bodies. So we have a system that's awesome. We have this great system in our body that God gave us, really. I mean, God put all this stuff in us to keep us safe and to be protective, to help us kind of deal with difficulty and pain and struggle in our lives. We've got this system inside of ourselves. But the system is not prepared for chronic, overwhelming rainfalls of abuse and violence and near-death experiences, or all or whatever different things that happen in our life to pile on to us. So our systems can become overwhelmed. And then because of that overwhelmed system, there's damage that can occur in our body and in the way that we respond and the way we relate to things. That's not to say that it's a sentence to a lifelong pattern of negativity, but there are some damaging things that are left. So basically, I view trauma as some external thing that occurs to us that's overwhelming to the body's system to deal with stress, and then the lifelong impact that can come from that and how we deal with that from ongoing. So that's kind of my little definition, and hopefully that's a helpful way to think about it. So when we're working with people who are in prison, then we think, okay, well, what happened to them? I want to collaborate with them. Oh, I'm hearing that there was something negative that had happened in their life that meant their system was overwhelmed, and now that we're dealing with the aftermath of that. All right, well, let's work with that. We can do that. Okay, if you look at this little image, what do you see? Well, you could see two people looking at each other. You could see two people. And what are they angry at each other? Or are they happy with each other? Or is it a vase? What is it? So when people look at that, you can see all kinds of different things. I just want to highlight there that this is the idea that trauma impacts everyone differently. And the same thing, trauma recovery can be very different. I think a lot of times we think, well, I have to go through stage 1, then stage 2, then no, we're all over the place. Sometimes we're feeling really good, and then other times we're super way behind, or whatever, however you want to label it. So that being said, let me just kind of share with you this little example. So here's a quick story. Rochelle is Joelle's older half-sister. Rochelle lived with her dad for part of her childhood, but moved in with her sister Joelle when their mom remarried. One night, the girls saw their mom's new husband break her nose. There was violence. Rochelle was devastated, and Joelle was traumatized because each perceived what they saw differently, as illustrated below. So here, Joelle saw, mommy's going to die. Rochelle saw, I've got to get help. Joelle's perception, he's going to kill us too. My life's in danger. Rochelle's perception, if he comes near me, I'll call the police. My heart is racing, says Joelle. Rochelle says, we have to keep quiet. Don't cry. Joelle says, this is happening to us because I am bad. Rochelle says, why did I have to come back here? Do you see a distinct difference in the way that they are responding to the situation? This is not because Joelle's has problems and Rochelle is fine, or what? It's a different way of experiencing the exact same stimuli. So who knows, Joelle's background in attachment may have led her to think things in one way, or maybe messages that she got as a younger person, or maybe because she was in the difficult situation for a longer period of time than Rochelle was, that she may be thinking, or her framework may be a little bit different than Rochelle's is. So if we stop and think, okay, well, let's look at this. Some classic characteristics of trauma that we would say Joelle's experience, perception of a threat to her survival. She was definitely experiencing that. She was overwhelmed with her capacity to cope. That's what I was talking about, that water system that becomes overwhelmed. Then unusual, sudden, or out of the ordinary. Of course, that's unusual and out of the ordinary to have that happen to you right in front of you as a young child, to see that violence in your home. Then feelings of helplessness and extreme horror. She did experience that. Threat of death or serious injury to self. She was experiencing that. But then Rochelle saw that exact same stimuli, perception of threat or survival. She felt like she could do something. She was going to call the police. She was going to try to get some help. She had some sort of impetus that she could do something about it. Overwhelmed with her capacity to cope. She had some things that she could do. Stay quiet, call the police, run whatever she thought she could do. Well, it's definitely unusual and sudden and out of the ordinary. There's nothing you can say about that. Her feelings of helplessness and extreme horror, it felt like she had motivation to try to make some change. So you can kind of see a bit of the difference there, that these two people experienced this exact same thing. And one, it's left a more traumatic experience, whereas Rochelle saw this as a really negative experience that it may not impact her in the long run like it did with Joelle. I feel like something else I want to kind of remind us of is this idea that it's not just post-traumatic response is not something that's just negative all the time, but to look at it as a strength. If we could always look at the strengths of persons who have been through trauma, that's super important. So look at it like, say, for instance, here's just an example of a strengths-based perspective. Say that you're working with a child, for instance, who's truant. And the child comes to you, and the family brings you to the child to you, and they didn't go to school for 3 days last week. There were 5 days in the week, and they did not go to school for 3 days. Well, we could sure focus on those 3 days. Why didn't it work? What happened? What was going on? Oh, what's all negative about that? Or we could say, what got you there those 2 days? What are the two things that you could build on that we could replicate again in the future? That's a true strength-based approach to trauma. To not be so focused on the negative. Yeah, we have to talk about it. We have to own up to what's happened to us. We have to recognize that. But also to really remember, what are the strengths? What you got you through? How did you survive that trauma? And how can you repeat that or draw on that same strength that you have to help you today? This is a little pyramid that sort of shows how trauma impacts people throughout their lives. So if you see this, what we call adverse childhood experiences, something negative, and there's certain things that we could list there, that impacts the development of the human person. Then that impacts the way that they relate to the world. So say, for instance, if I'm abused as a young person, then maybe that might impact how my body responds to that. And then because my body's trying to deal with this, then maybe I can't engage with other people very well, or I don't know how to express my emotional life very well, or even I don't think very clearly about myself or about relationships. And that's going to lead me to do something to try to make myself feel better. So if I'm feeling all these negative things, I'm going to want to smoke, I'm going to want to drink, I'm going to want to take drugs, I'm going to do some risky behaviors just to take away the pain. Well, as we know, that adoption of that type of risky behaviors then can lead to disease and disabilities, which leads to an early death. We know that as the lifespan goes, if people who have been experienced negative traumas in their life, that it leads to an early death. And if nothing else, it leads to a difficult older years in their life because of the response, or they're trying to cope with this through negative or maladaptive patterns. There was a study done that showed that 64% of a 17,000 sample size that was middle income people, upper and middle income people that had experienced trauma. So imagine if you live in a neighborhood that's unsafe, or if you live in poverty, or if you live in a situation where there's racial strife or racism, you're the brunt of that, then that's going to only increase your probability of having a negative life experience like this. I want to bring that up and put it through the lens of this concept of racial trauma. Many of the persons who are incarcerated currently, because of our society's system, are ended up incarcerated because of this, because of racial injustice. So I feel like a lot of times people say, oh, well, that's not a factor, or that isn't, but just think about it. Actually, a quick story. I teach, at the University of Tennessee, and so one day it snowed. And when it snows in Knoxville, nobody goes anywhere. So none of the students came. Well, none of the white students came to my class. But the 7 black students that were in the class all attended, which to me, I think showed that all the white people felt like that they didn't have to show, but then the black people were nervous because if they didn't go, would they be viewed negatively? So that was something, I think, in the first place. But I just got to sit down with them and kind of talk about their lives on the campus at the University of Tennessee, a place of higher ed that's done all kinds of things to try to mitigate racism. Well, they talked about coming out of the library one night and somebody just screaming the N-word at them. Or one girl talked about another white girl bumping her as she walked through the hall and said negative things about her just because of her race. So imagine about the system that a person has, being able to deal with stress and trauma and that, if it's always heightened, if it's always has to be on alert because somebody's going to view me negatively or treat me negatively because of who I am, that is a chronic traumatic event that occurs. So imagine the people that are incarcerated, or that people who are in prison that have to deal with all of the things, the triggering responses to law enforcement, and how tough that can be. So it's a real thing, a real studied thing that happens. And to bring about just a little bit of a further thing, just some other things to think about. I think that a lot of times that when you look at the adverse childhood experiences, there's a list of them, but never is racism included in that. But I feel like we as a society and we as a scientific community have to really study that more to try to understand, so it becomes a much more valid and understood thing. And through history, did you know that there were like scientific things that like this drapetomania, which said that it was in 1851, somebody said that if a slave wanted to escape, that it was a mental disorder, and it was called drapetomania. That's ridiculous. So then you kind of think about, well, that's ridiculous in 1851 for us to look back on that now. But then sometimes now we end up diagnosing people who are Black or people of color because of maybe their reaction to a certain thing or because of some way that they're responding. But it might be out of trauma. It might be out of a racial trauma experience. So just the bottom line of this slide is that not addressing this isn't an option. So I feel like that's an important thing for us to address and to walk through. It's not easy to do, but it's important. All that said, and I know that I'm getting close, sort of close. I have a few more minutes to talk, and then we can have some questions and interaction. But I feel like this is super important. A couple things to say to you all, and then I'm going to race through the end. That, okay, when we think about trauma, think about our body. That when we think about if our ancestors that were like living in caves or whatever they did, ancestors did wherever they lived, if they saw a tiger or a wild animal, they would, of course, automatically, their body would hit the trigger to go run like crazy, get out of there. So it would be a short-lived thing. Here's this danger that I detect with my eyes, and I know I've learned that this is dangerous. So I'm going to run and get the heck out of there. That's a natural response, but it's a short-lived response and then is resolved. Once you're safe from the tiger, back in another cave or whatever, you're safe and the body resolves and goes back to its normal sort of state that it would follow. But the problem these days is that the tiger lives in our home, and then it's really sad for the folks that you all are working with if the tiger is living in the situation that they're in. Because think about this, a lot of times now, what was meant to be a bodily system that would respond to a tiger jolt an amount of cortisol in the body that would make us move and run away or fight back in some way is now being enacted. If you live in a home where there's violence or difficulty, that body is always reacting to this negative violence that's occurring in the place where you live. Or maybe if you live in a neighborhood where there's gunshots and you hear it outside, your body's always in that fight, flight, stress, freeze mode. And therefore, that's destructive. When our body was intended to have a shot of cortisol run through our body to make us run and be safe and then resolve. But unfortunately, in situations today, that cortisol is continuing to run through our body or be released through our body, and it's destructive to the body. That's a chemical that's only supposed to be in your body in a short amount of bursts, but it ends up being through the body through a lot, and it can be damaging. So this is a tough thing. So if I'm supposed to live or be raised in this place where the tiger's in my home and I'm always chronically stressed out, that's chronic trauma and is very difficult and very damaging to the body. If we can kind of think about this from a couple different ways in looking at the brain, see that green part of the brain? That's where certain organs are a part of the brain, and they are helping us respond. There's like an alarm system in there that keeps us alert. So if there's a smell, if there's a sight, like a tattoo on the guy's arm in the case study at the beginning, if there is maybe a sound that rings a bell, then that might trigger in our brain a response like, oh, this is danger. So say, for instance, maybe I've heard of this, like a cologne. Maybe someone was abused as a child and the abuser used some certain cologne. Then they're later, as adults, they smell that cologne on another person, and then it triggers the response. And then they begin acting out of the typical way that they normally would. The same thing kind of with the guy seeing the tattoo on his shoulder, then he's engaging in behavior that's out of the norm. Well, you see that red part up there of the brain? That is a more, the part that's looking at logical, rational decision making. That part is not engaged when we're reacting out of trauma. So imagine someone who sees the tiger. Of course, you don't have time to make a strategic plan about how you're going to run away from the tiger, so that's automatically shut off. I run and get out. But if I'm in a chronic state, or if I'm always in stress or always in trauma response, then I'm never utilizing this prefrontal cortex. Therefore, I'm just going to act. I'm going to act, and it's not going to be safe or wisely thought out. And I may end up in prison. I may end up in a difficult situation because I'm not using that prefrontal cortex to think things through. I'm just responding. So all this happens through the cells in our brain. I'm going to just skip through this part. So this is what's happening. Toxic stress occurs, goes through the brain, cortisol is released repeatedly, then that impacts the immune system and it brings about an inflammatory response in our bodies. And then therefore that reduces our infection fighting capabilities in the body. And then it impacts our genetic expression that we can then, which we used to not think that trauma or social conditions impacted our genetic makeup so much that we could pass it on to the next generation. But yet we know now that it does. And we call that study epigenetics, above the gene. It's like how the things that happen to the genetic makeup are passed on. There's a study in particular where we know that grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are more likely to have depression and anxiety than another control group. So that there is a difference. We can see depression and anxiety, so we know that maybe that's been passed on. Back to my comment about racial trauma, imagine the centuries of trauma that's been passed on through Black, Indigenous, people of color. So that's an important thing to recognize. So before I wrap up, let me just say here that that there's a couple things that just to kind of put it in a simple step here. So normally, when we're going through our day, there it is. We observe things, there's input, we interpret it, evaluate our options, and then we act on what that's based on. The bummer is that sometimes, or the good thing is, that occasionally there'll be something dangerous happening. So a roadblock gets put up in our brain and we don't engage that front part of the brain. So we kind of go the back way. We're going the quick way around. We're going to just react. So here's a stimuli, I'm going to react. Here's the stimuli. I noticed this tattoo on my cellmate's arm, which brings back the horrible memories of me being abused as a child. Therefore, I'm not going to think it through and really think about it. My body's just going to react, and therefore I'm going to act out of that. The bummer is that if we're in some sort of chronic state of trauma, then our alarm system road becomes the main highway for us, and we're never using that, evaluating options, planning, and all that kind of stuff. We're just reacting out of things. And again, this is what's happening to many people who end up maybe in prison, maybe in difficult situations, because they haven't thought through what they're doing. They're just reacting out of the pain and the response to trauma, which is completely natural. It's a natural thing. So how do we help people with this? Well, also, I feel like there's a couple things to just kind of highlight there about, I feel like I've already kind of talked about. How do we respond to this? I feel like we take the universal precautions of just assuming that everybody that you're coming in contact with has had some sort of traumatizing event. And therefore, we're mindful of that, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. So we're kind of taking it from a universal approach. Research shows, to back this stuff up, PTSD in the general population, you can see 10% and 5% of women and men, but look at the change there. Almost half of women and 30% of male inmates have had, of male prisoners have had that, had trauma in their life. And then you can kind of see again that here's some other studies that have showed the lifetime physical violence in women and men, lifetime trauma witnessing, lifetime sexual trauma, and you can see the amounts are way above the someone off the street. Okay, I'm just gonna skip this. So here's just one quick thing at the end here about how we can respond to this. We're aware. So we've talked about it now for just a little bit. We're aware of how trauma impacts a person's life and how we can maybe deal with it through a collaborative approach. That we want to do what we can to say, I'm safe with you. Or, I'm sorry, you're safe with me. When I'm meeting with you or working with you in a ministry setting, to always be aware that you're conveying safety to them, that this is an island for you. Trustworthiness. So I think if I come in and say to an inmate, or a person who's incarcerated, if I say to them, you can trust me, they've heard that before. And that's going to be reactive. They're going to react negatively to that. So I think, well, I've heard all this before, trust me, and then I end up being exploited or hurt in some way. But what a great way would it say, I want to earn your trust. I'd love to earn your trust. I'd love to be a trustworthy person for you. Can you help me do that? And then the control is on the person, not on you saying, hey, look, trust me, everything's going to be okay. They've heard that before. Think about that in a way of trustworthiness. Choice. What can you do to provide some sort of choice? Where do you want to meet within the limitations that you're set in? And what do you want to talk about? All those kind of things. What can you do? Again, collaboration, empowerment. And then I know like many of us are going in as ministers with our own understanding of what church is or who God is or what all that is about. But we're going to be meeting, I'm sure, with people who come from all kinds of different ways of understanding all those things. So I think in whatever way we can to be responsive or welcoming or in tune or accepting of someone's understanding of who God is, then that's going to be a cultural thing that's really important to us to have some sort of cultural humility. And then we can kind of see what this is about. Oh, wait. This I want to say. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. You, in your life and in your work, are going to be impacted by this. You're going to think about it when you get home. You're going to struggle with it when the day is done. So how are you going to care for yourself and realize that some of these traumatic responses that you're witnessing or hearing about from the persons who are in prison that you're working with are going to impact you and trigger your own traumatic responses. So it's going to be important. How am I planning to care for myself? Am I taking some time for prayer? Am I taking some time for mindfulness? Am I taking some time for my own relationships? Am I able to kind of like put this away in my life for just a few minutes as I kind of live the rest of my life? So I feel like that's super important, this self-care concept. So those are just briefly some of my ideas. We could talk about this for hours, and I think I probably gave couple hours worth of information, but said it so fast that hopefully. So I'm going to stop sharing and then see if we have a chance for any questions or anything.
Yes, thank you. That was really comprehensive and really helpful. And you sort of touched on at the end on the issue or the phenomenon of vicarious traumatization or secondary trauma. And along those lines, one of my former colleagues from the CDCR here in California asked about what about the incarcerated regularly having to deal with staff who are stressed in the toxic environment they're working in? And how do volunteers and chaplains deal with this and with both sides?
I feel like the question is about how, say, if as a chaplain I'm working with someone who's employed at the prison system.
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, I think as we know, 64% of this general population has had some sort of traumatic event. And I think that the folks that are there are probably seeing some really difficult things as well. I feel like the whole thing is, again, kind of what we're talking about is what do you need from me? Like not, hey, I'm here to help you, whatever, what do you want me to do for you? But how can I help you? Or engaging the client and saying, or not client, engaging the colleague there and say, hey, look, I know I'm a minister to these persons who are here, but I'd like to help in any way that I can with you if you ever need anything or whatever. And it's the collaboration there, and that the ball is in their court in a way rather than imposed on them. I think that kind of is a great way. And I really do think, I can't tell you how over and over and over I've heard that the importance of just listening. If somebody has someone else in their life that they can at least talk to, or that they can at least have it on their side, that can be so corrective. It's important. They call that corrective relationship. I just think that that's so important. One thing that we talk about with trauma studies and all this is this idea of attachment, and that sometimes trauma can occur in an early infancy, or maybe a parent has been traumatized and then they can't fully engage with their infant, and how important attachment from one human infant to another really is. And there's a biologically a window for some of that, but even as adults, our brains are plastic. There's a plasticity, meaning that new neurons can grow and develop. So if I'm in a relationship with somebody, I can still help build a healthy brain through the healthy relationship that I have with another person. That's really important.
Yeah, I think it's so important to be mindful of when the people you're working with as colleagues in the prison, or the correction officers, or the administrators, how they are impacted by the environment and how they are traumatized almost daily. And I've also discovered in my experience that a lot of the men and women coming into the profession of corrections are coming out of the military. And so many of them have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and have not even necessarily processed those traumas. And then they're in a very potentially violent situation. So I think it's important for us as ministers, volunteers, or chaplains, just to be sensitive and mindful to what the staff are going through. And that ultimately we help the prisoners by helping the staff. Another person asked an interesting question here, and that is, he says, sometimes I work with inmates processing feelings and experiences of shame. I think that person's response to shameful events might be similar to how they experience trauma. Any thoughts on this? So the relationship between shame and trauma, that's a good question.
I mean, I feel like it's tight, really tight. You think about like how many times. I mean, I think in my therapeutic work that I've done that, how many people have maybe someone has done something to them and completely out of their control, but then feel like that they're to blame. And I think some of that has to do with like what period of development the thing occurred or the trauma occurred and things like that. That we want to blame ourselves, and then that brings about that shame. And we know that shame isn't just I'm not sad or depressed or angry about what I did, but I'm sad and depressed and worried about who I am. And that's just a terrible thing. And so if I feel like that, I know like this has kind of worked a little bit. That like sometimes someone asked this, and I saw that this work. That the question, what does this shame? How does experiencing this shame, or how does ruminating around this shame benefit you? How does that help you in any way? And then sometimes people come up with an answer and they think, oh, well, but I don't want to do, I don't want to say that because it feels like you're blaming the person for having the shame because you don't want to do that. But then sometimes I feel like sometimes we're just comfortable in the shame or whatever. That's a place I feel safe because I haven't felt safe anywhere else. So therefore, I'm just going to buy into what I know other people are thinking or whatever already. But there is that little benefit there. So maybe we could say, like, well, come out of that for a little bit. What if you didn't have that? Let's pretend for a minute that you don't that you are viewing yourself positively or whatever. That could be just a way to kind of address it in one way. But it is. I feel like that in my experience, so much shame and response to trauma is really tightly connected.
Yeah, and it's also, unfortunately, the environment of prisons and jails are in themselves shaming. People are being shamed by society and being judged as unworthy or bad people. And so that reinforces the traumas as well. Someone asks, how does hearing one's story help healing an inmate suffering from trauma? And I think they mean, how does sharing one's own trauma help somebody that we're trying to help in ministry?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked that because, like, I think sometimes I feel like I want to. This is me. Like, I want to jump to because I mean, all my life didn't completely. I didn't tiptoe through the tulips. You know what I mean? I had some little things going on in my life too, some traumatic things in my life. And sometimes when somebody's talking about something, I think, oh, I had that too. I had that too. There's a beneficial part to that, but I feel like it's super important to remember that our focus is during this ministry time. The focus is on the person that you're working with. So I feel like when I want to tell about myself, whose need am I meeting? Am I doing this because I feel like this is really going to be beneficial and so they won't feel so alone, which is awesome. But am I doing it because I also want to like, hey, I want to get this off my chest, or I don't know. Like we all have things. Sometimes I have to stop myself from telling stuff because there's just no need. Like I feel like I'm just saying it to say it. And I don't have to go into gory detail and all, but like I feel like that there is a place and a time for that, but I feel like it's always to check myself before I'm spilling the beans about myself and kind of sharing. Because I know, like with this role, with you as a minister, you are someone that they can lean on, that the person could lean on and have trust in. And as much as we want to collaborate, still it's not really a friendship. I mean, it's not. I mean, you're friendly, your friendliness, but it's not like a friendship. So you need to be mindful of what I'm saying to this person. Is it going to somehow re-traumatize them, or is it really going to be something? So I don't know if that made sense, but I think checking with ourselves before we reveal to others is really an important element.
I think that's really very clear, and it's a great response, and it's a really important issue. And I really would second that in that we have to always remember our boundaries. Our role there is as helping people heal. We're not going in there as friends, and so the boundary question is really important. And I would say personally, my experience over the years is that probably 99 times out of 100, we don't need to share our experience. We can use our experience of having been hurt to empathize with what the person is going through, but the focus has to be on them and their healing, and avoid falling into a pattern of it kind of becomes needy on our part, or we're not there to become friends. That's ultimately not helping the prisoner.
It is really true. That's true. And sometimes I know, like, I say that to my students in social work, and they're all like, what? I'm here to be helping. But like, yeah, but you're there to be helping in this certain way. You know, there's different ways to help, and this is the way that you're in a relationship with them. This is the relationship that you have with them.
Yeah, and I think whether you're a professional paid chaplain or a volunteer going in, you're still there in a professional capacity. So really the power dynamics are, you have the power often, and you have to be sensitive to that and how you use that. One person asks, how do you recommend talking about the significance of systemic racism and trauma responses with people who just don't seem to get it, or insist race has nothing to do with it, or perhaps are offended or challenged by that?
So my niece, who's 17, and she's hysterical and full of white privilege. I mean, the girl is like, she's just, you know, because that's, I mean, as we are. And so she said the other day, there was a debate about whether you can use the N-word within my family. She says, and she said, our ancestors owned human beings, and then our race has set another race back a couple centuries. And they ask us to not say one word, and we can't do it. I thought that was, I mean, here she's 17, and, you know, she's interested in boys and all those things. But here, this is what she says. And I thought, that's so cool. She's thinking about it. I mean, I know that's not the summation of it. It's not what we're all that anyone is asking of us. But I just thought that, like, I thought that really made me think. And I just think some simple comment like that, or just being willing to talk about it or willing to engage in it. Like, and I think, like, if I'm coming at somebody with my finger wagging, like, you know, hey, you're being a racist, whatever. But, like, I think, like, owning it. You know, I mean, I was raised in a very, you know, in a southern area with, you know, certain, you know, cultural mores around these issues. And that's formed how I think. And I need to challenge that for myself. Do you ever experience that for yourself? Like, that kind of question, like, I want to invite you into an exploration that I'm trying to understand. And I think that we as a country are trying to wrestle with, and we should be wrestling with it. So I feel like that's just to me is that whole collaboration thing around this issue, is that I'm in this and I want to invite you into it too. I want to collaborate with you on trying to heal each other from this. I don't know if then there's all kinds of resources. I was just telling Father George before this that this Me and White Supremacy, it's a great book, and we're using it as a book discussion club at the college. And it's like super, like, just things to think about, just stuff that I didn't ever really realize that I've done. And I think once we start discovering it, then we can recognize it. Just language we use or the way we speak or modeling it, it could be good too.
Could you hold that book up again and tell us who the author is?
Yes, it's Layla Saad, S-A-A-D, and it's Me and White Supremacy is the name of the book. And it's got little, like it's like a daily reflection or a weekly reflection, and the publisher is, well, I can't see what the publisher is. Anyway, but it's S-A-A-D, Me and White Supremacy. Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor. So it's Source Books is the publisher.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is analogous to working with prisoners. Those of us who are from the dominant culture, you know, we need to learn from people's experiences of what they experienced in a society where they experienced the effects of racism. So I think to be in a listening mode and learning mode, not imposing our opinions upon them, but rather learning from them is important. Whether they're people of color talking about racism or whether they're prisoners talking about their experiences, it really has to be focused on the other in this case. Yeah. Someone asked a good question about the issue about re-entry. And I know from my experience, working mostly with men, is that while they look forward to getting out, they're terrified. And so this person asked, what is your experience with providing support for someone who's worried about release re-entry? How can we be most supportive with people in this situation?
Whew, that's a big question. That's a huge one. So actually, this is what kind of the work that I did early in my career was an alternative sentencing situation where people went from prison out into the community, and it was a tough transition. I think about this in relationship to how, like, say if I had a traumatic experience as a young person, and then this is what I've lived in, and so then therefore maybe I'm engaging in alcohol use or drug use or something like that. That's the kind of the prison in quotes that I'm in, and so having to make a change out of that is really, really tough. So all the things about change and about all that are really big to come out of that. So I can't even imagine how, like, your entire life, every second of your day is in one thing. thing, and then now you're transitioning to something else where you're going to have to make your own decisions, and you're going to have to decide where you're going to live, and you're going to have to decide what to do when you get up in the morning. I mean, that's a whole other thing. So I feel like that that's something important where you're saying that I don't know how the ministry goes, if you will continue after the person is released, but I think just to be sure that there's some relationship that the person can have when they are released, that if there can be somebody that they can have, if it's not you, that you assure that they've connected with someone externally, so you can keep that safe relationship, that there's a contact person. I just feel like that's to have somebody in your corner, even if it's just one person. I feel like that's a big deal. That whole relational aspect, I think, is just really important to continue. That's just one thought.
Okay, and along those lines, someone else is asking, maybe a little more specifically, he says he was trying to help a former prisoner escape from homelessness, but because of his traumatization in prison, he was unable to bring himself to go into a dorm environment. And so how do we help when trauma responses keep creating more obstacles for people? And so he says in reentry work, the focus tends to be on relief issues, not the deeper issues. How do we shift the conversation for people who are reentering?
So a couple things. Like one thought that immediately comes to mind is that I think when we're in a traumatic response, kind of like the tigers in the living room, a lot of times I'm thinking I am back in the midst of the trauma. So like maybe I'm living out in the community and I'm not in prison anymore, but my mindset is I'm still back there because that's what my body is doing. My body is used to being there, so it's like created this thing where I'm there. So I feel like maybe sometimes, like if I'm with someone and kind of working through some of these things, something called grounding technique, which is where you like, okay, I feel my feet in my shoes. I feel my butt in the chair. I can see the color on the wall. I see the color of the sky. Like sensorily, I'm being directed to look at what's in around me. I'm here. I'm now. I'm not there. I'm not then. So if there's some way to say this is different, this experience is different than that, like if you can say, look, you're safe now. Look, are you in danger now? How are you feeling now? What's going on right in the moment? And that's a big deal about like this mindfulness, which is a whole other workshop, I guess, but just this thing about being grounded in the moment and being aware of where I am right now. I feel like that's been helpful for lots of folks I've worked with. So sometimes, like if I've been talking with somebody in a session or something, and then I realize that they're kind of beginning to freak out or something, you kind of go back to the there and then kind of thing. Then to think, like say, you could just say a casual, hey, what do you think of this painting here? It's right here and right now. What do you think of the colors in it? What do you see in it? Or what do you think of how's that chair? Is that chair comfortable? Can you tell me about that? So you're sort of sneaking in a little bit of grounding technique. And I know like for people who are homeless maybe, but like to think about where are you here and now and how is it different than where you were then? Even that kind of dichotomy to say, look, this is a different setup. So if we're orienting our body and our senses back to being here and now rather than that could be, I feel like at least one aspect of help. There's lots of things, but that's the first thing that came to my mind.
Great. We have about 7 more minutes, and before we will go to the end, but I want to just take a moment for some commercial announcements of our upcoming town halls and webinars. Our next NACC town hall meeting is going to be on February 18th, and you can find information on the CPMC website. And the title is going to be Gatekeepers, the Inside Outside Program. That's again, February 18th, the NACC Town Hall. Then the next town hall after that will be on March 4th. It will be a panel discussion with Father Dustin Fedden, Dr. Catherine Geddick-Soltis, and Dr. Kim Laymore. And they're going to be discussing racism and trauma, kind of processing some of the information we've got today, and some of the things we've talked about over the last couple webinars. So this information will be on the CPMC website. Again, that's March 4th, Town Hall. Our next webinar like this for the CPMC, Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, will be Wednesday, March 10th, and that's going to be at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time, or 10 o'clock for those of us on the West Coast. And the topic, timely enough, will be Lent, a time for reflection, because by then we'll be in the middle of Lent. And the host that day for that discussion will be Father Daniel Renaud. He teaches at the Oblate School of Theology. Before you, after the webinar is over, you'll receive an email with a survey, and it would really help us if you would respond to that to kind of give us an evaluation of this and other webinars that we are planning and that we've had in the past. So anyway, well, back to the topic at hand. Pardon the commercial interruption. Somebody asked, they're offering here some information on a video. It's called The Prison Within, and it's on Amazon Prime. So that's a great resource that you can, if those of you who wish to follow up on that. The Prison Within on Amazon Prime. Father Ragan, you were talking about the book you were reading, and I also want to plug Dr. Joy Degree, Degruy, a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. It's also a very good, and it's helpful to kind of get a sense of the kind of trauma and pain that people, not only the enslaved people, but their descendants have experienced. The epigenetic handing down of this trauma from generation to generation is very powerful, very difficult, but really important for us to read and be aware of. Let me see, we have a few other questions. I wanted to get to everybody who responded. Somebody asked here, how do we deal with losing a pen pal while being incarcerated? Sort of traumatic. How do we transition the inmate or the resident to a new relationship through letter writing? So for whatever reason, if we have a disruption of the pen pal relationship, that's a loss. How do we deal with that?
You know, like a lot of this research, especially since the pandemic, about how telehealth and text messaging for behavioral health reasons is just almost as helpful as in face. I mean, there's a lot of evidence about that. So I can think about how important or how interesting it would be for a pen pal to have that same kind of relationship with their the person that they're writing with, that it can be a real relationship. And so I feel like that it's important to recognize that there needs to be grief. I need to own that there's sadness or that type of thing. But I think if I have to switch from an in-person to a pen pal kind of thing, I feel like that we can do that in an effective way. But if the relationship is ending in a way, then that can be tough. I mean, it can be really tough, and to recognize that and not just say, "Oh, we were just pen pals. Why are you so worried?" That's not going to be helpful. Yeah. I think it's important to recognize it.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Another person here, a chaplain, writes, how do we chaplains deal with our own trauma of dealing with the loss of detainees or prisoners when they commit suicide? I ask because I lost 5 guys in 1 year to suicide at the county jail. This is a common, unfortunately, tragic experience that we've all gone through.
Oh my gosh, that to me that is traumatic, and I feel like what I always say to the students in social work is use your supervision. Use that you have a supervisor and supervisor not just somebody that tells you what to do, but that you talk to about cases and your own involvement with the case and all that. I hope all of you have somebody good that you can reach out to, because this is real trauma. I mean, someone that was real in your life. You were in relationship with that person. They may not have been your friend or family member, but you were in a real relationship with them, and it's a loss. It's a grief. To how do I grieve that? Not just, I feel like you're not in the business of just making cars or drilling things or whatever, as important that is it's maybe not as emotionally engaging, but to think about that when you are transitioning, or that occurs to you, that you've got somebody to talk to, that somebody that's in your corner that you can be completely unabashedly honest with, that's not going to use it against you in your workplace or anything like that, just to talk with. Have that person.
That's really important, whether it's a counselor, a peer, or a spiritual director. I remember when Mikey Hanscom was one of my favorite frequent flyers at the Boston City Jail, and he was doing really well for a while, but then he died from a heroin overdose, and it was so heartbreaking. And I still remember the most helpful thing I heard in that early part of my formation as a minister was one of the social workers said to me, well, we're not here to fix them. We're here to love them and accompany them. Ultimately, they're in God's hands. And so I think to the degree that we're able to really realize that we can't fix everybody, we're not there to do that, but we are there to love them. And I think, but when these tragic things happen, and they will, like you're saying, it's so important to rely on our support network to help us, because it's, we experience grief and loss from all of these experiences, and it can be cumulative. Well, unfortunately, we're up at the end of our hour, so I think we've covered a lot of really rich material, and I thank you so much, Father Ragan, for being with us today. Several people have asked for your PowerPoints, so if you would send us the email, we'll put it up on our website. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be up in a few days on the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition website. So thank you all so much for being with us, and God bless.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the work that all of you are doing. Super important. Thank you. Bless you all.